So in this chapter, chapter 3, what we're going to look at, the central thing we're going to look at is this thing called covenant. And a covenant is a mutual agreement, a binding mutual agreement between two parties. And in this case, in this revelation that we find in the scriptures, it's the covenant between God and God's people. And the first covenant we see is with Noah, the famous rainbow sign of the end of the flood. But the flood itself was a reaction to the violence that ensued from the disobedience of our first parents, if you like. Now, let's get straight in our heads what we're talking here about poetic imagery in the ancient mind. There's no sense in which we're talking about history or science here. What we're talking about is a meditation on the human condition. And the notion of the flood, which you find also in other cultures, is this idea that, certainly for the Hebrew man, the 40 days and 40 nights, a time of transformation. And in that time of transformation, because the earth's been filled with violence, the violence is cleansed from the earth. And Noah and his little family and the preserved animal kingdom emerge from the storied ark to fill the earth once more. And this early picture, this prehistory, if you like, of Israel, then segues into the much more earthed story of Abraham. And it's only around the time when we're meeting the character of Abraham that we're really encountering anything like the kind of history that we might understand as such. Abraham, Avram, these are names from extant in that part of the world in those days, around 2000 or so BC. And what happens there is, it's as if the drama of creation then becomes focused in on the relation between God and one human being, Abraham. And Abraham becomes, if you like, the image of the human being who seeks for God, seeks the one God with all his heart, and is prepared to leave his homeland to be nearer to God, to obey God, to build altars to God, to make sacrifice to God, to be, if you like, God's ambassador on earth. And in the vicissitudes, the ups and downs of Abraham's life, we find the promise that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars of heaven, which for an old guy with a fairly old spouse is looking a bit far-fetched. But ultimately God honours this covenant, and the son Isaac is born. And again, you may or may not know that Yitzhak is a name for laughter, because it was A, a joyful event, but B, was almost unbelievably laughable that the old folks would have a child so late in life. Now, fast forwarding on all this, this notion of covenant then becomes as it is a binding thing, becomes the binding theme for what we call the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the scriptures. And most famously, in the centre of those stories, we see the figure of Moses, someone who, again like Abraham, is called by God and chosen by God to be a leader of the people. And he, in leading his people out of Egypt, they're there because of famine in the promised land. In leading his people out of Egypt and meeting God on Sinai and hearing from God the famous 10 words or the 10 commands, what does Moses do? He articulates in a timeless fashion the centerpiece of the covenant with God. And this centerpiece, we can think of the commandments as negatives. No, 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 no. You can't, you can't, you can't. But no, think about the context in which the commands are given. Because I've set you free, you will not be enslaved to other gods. You'll not be enslaved to your own desires, your own avarice, your own propensity to be untruthful, your own greed. your own sense of entitlement. You will respect and love one another. You will not kill each other, etc. So this idea that the commands are part of the freedom narrative fits very well with what the covenant's about. It's a mutual agreement to set the people free. And this family, this chosen people, they're a rabble, they're a tumult, becoming more and more numerous. They are the ones who eventually then stand on the cusp of the promised land. Moses takes them that far. And in a sense, at that point, we are left with this drama. What will this people do? Because at the end of the day, if I go back to my scriptures, we do call it the good book, and rightly so. But what we're going to find is that this story of this people, emboldened and privileged with this relationship with God, which the covenant represents, it's almost as a lesson in how not to do it, in how not to live as a people of God. And that's the theological drama that we're dealing with in the Pentateuch and going forward in the prophets